Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Althea Hayes. I am 70 years old, and for 42 of those years, I was a professor of history. If you're interested in true stories about wisdom, dignity, and justice long overdue, please remember to like and subscribe. Today, I am going to share a story about legacy and a painful lesson I was forced to teach long after my retirement. It is a story about the difference between an inheritance of wealth and an inheritance of principle. A story that taught me that sometimes the quietest actions are the ones that echo the loudest through the halls of a family. My home is not so much a house as it is a library with living quarters attached. Its scent is one of my life's great comforts. The dry, sweet perfume of old paper, the faint, sharp tang of leather binding, and the clean aroma of the lemon oil I use to polish the endless shelves of oak. These books are not decoration. They are my colleagues, my sparring partners, and my oldest friends. Each spine is a story, not just the one printed within its pages, but the story of where I was when I first read it, what I was thinking, and the notes I scribbled in its margins. My days have a quiet, scholarly rhythm. Though I am officially retired, the mind of a historian never truly is. This morning, for instance, I spent 2 hours cross-referencing Tacitus' account of the Great Fire of Rome with more modern archaeological surveys. It is a puzzle with no final answer, a simple intellectual exercise for my own satisfaction. It is this process, the patient accumulation of facts, the careful weighing of evidence, the formulation of a thesis, that has been the central organizing principle of my entire existence. A life, like a historical event, can be understood if one simply takes the time to examine the primary sources. In the center of my large oak desk, beneath the soft, focused glow of a green banker's lamp, sits a single framed photograph. It is the only image that has a permanent place amidst the clutter of research notes and fountain pens. It is not of my late husband, a brilliant man whose memory is a part of the very fabric of this house. It is a photo of my son, Marcus, on the day of his university graduation. He is beaming, his gown slightly askew, holding a diploma that represented the single most important project of my life. Marcus was my masterpiece. I approached his upbringing with the same meticulous care I would a doctoral dissertation. I provided the resources, I curated the environment, and I invested everything I had, not just financially, but intellectually and emotionally, into his success. His mind was sharp, his ambition boundless. He became a successful investment analyst, a man who navigated the modern world of finance with a speed and confidence that often left me breathless. He spoke a language of assets and acquisitions that was foreign to my world of footnotes and philosophies, but I was intensely proud. The sacrifices had been worth it. The extra summer courses I taught to afford his tuition, the academic conferences I skipped to ensure I was there for his school events, the quiet selling of my husband's small but valuable collection of first editions. They were all simply investments in his future. He was the culmination of my life's work, a living testament to a well-executed plan. My 70 years have taught me that the foundation of any great civilization, or any strong family, is the unspoken contract between generations. The elders provide the wisdom and the means, and the young provide the energy and the respect. It is a simple, elegant system that has worked for millennia. In 2 days, I will turn 70. Marcus, in his typically efficient way, has arranged everything. A party, he called it, a surprise gathering of my former colleagues, old friends, and family. He has managed the invitations and the catering with the precision of a corporate merger. I find his modern efficiency somewhat brisk at times, but I appreciate the sentiment. A celebration of my life, he had said. A life of accomplishment, of dedication, of a legacy I believed to be secure. I look at his graduation photo, at the proud, confident young man in the frame. I feel a quiet sense of contentment wash over me. I have built a good life. I have raised a successful son. The shelves are full, the work is done, and a milestone is to be celebrated among loved ones. All is in its proper place. My son, Marcus, operates on a different temporal plane than I do. My world is one of deep time, of centuries and epochs. His is a world of nanoseconds and quarterly reports. A historian seeks patterns over the long arc of time. An investment analyst seeks advantage in the immediate, fleeting present. I have always believed this difference to be a source of our family's strength, the sturdy roots of my experience, anchoring the soaring branches of his ambition. He called me the day before the party, his voice coming through the phone with its usual crisp efficiency. There was no preamble, no gentle easing into conversation. Marcus believed in getting straight to the point. "Mom, just running point on tomorrow's event," he began. Wanted to circle back and confirm a few final logistics. "Event," I mused aloud, a small smile playing on my lips. "It sounds so formal, Marcus. It's a birthday party." "It's a milestone event, Mom. 70 years. We want to optimize the guest experience." I sighed softly, a sound I hoped he did not hear. There it was. The language of his world, a dialect of sanitized corporate jargon that always felt slightly alien in my library. He did not speak of happiness, but of guest experience. He did not speak of planning, but of logistics. It was, I told myself, simply the way his generation communicated. It was the language of success. Well, as long as my old friend Dr. Albright is seated somewhere comfortable for his back, the guest experience will be perfectly optimized, I said, a hint of dry humor in my tone. "Noted," he replied, and I could almost hear the click of an imaginary checkbox in his mind. "Now, the caterer is confirmed. The timeline is set. I just need you to be ready by 6 o'clock sharp. And Mom, please, wear the blue dress we talked about. It has the right look." Nay, the right look. As if my own life were a brand he was managing. I thought back to my 30th birthday. My husband, Robert, had surprised me with a single perfect slice of cheesecake from a small bakery we both love. We ate it in our small kitchen, the scent of beeswax from a solitary candle filling the air. It was a simple, profound gesture of love. It had the right look because it looked like us. I remember for my 30th birthday, I began, wanting to share the warmth of the memory. "Your father?" "That's nice, Mom," he cut in, not unkindly, but with the unmistakable impatience of a man with a schedule to keep. "Listen, I can't stay on. I have a conference call in 5. The main reason I called is about my gift." I felt a familiar surge of pride, pushing aside the flicker of disappointment. His focus, his drive, these were the very qualities that had propelled him to success. "A gift, Marcus. You've already given me the gift of this lovely party." "This is different," he said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice now. This was the part of the project that truly engaged him. The big reveal. "This is the value add. A real game changer, Mom. It's a long-term strategic solution for you. I think you're going to be blown away." A strategic solution. The phrase hung in the air after he said it. A solution to what? I was not a problem to be solved. I was his mother. But his enthusiasm was infectious, and I chose to interpret his strange words through the lens of love. He was a man who showed his affection through grand, effective gestures. He had always been that way. For my 65th birthday, he hadn't bought me a simple bouquet. He had arranged for a year-long membership to the botanical gardens. It was efficient, impressive, and thoughtful in its own large-scale way. "Well, you certainly know how to build suspense," I said warmly. "I look forward to it, dear." "Great. 6 o'clock sharp, Mom. Love you." The line went dead. He had said the words, but they felt like the concluding item on a meeting agenda. I placed the receiver back in its cradle, the silence of the library settling around me once more. A feeling of dissonance lingered, the quiet intellectual unease of encountering a primary source whose subtext contradicts its literal meaning. The words spoke of love and celebration, but the tone spoke of management and logistics. I looked at his photograph on my desk, the smiling graduate full of promise. I felt a swell of pride in the competent, successful man he had become. He was a product of a different era, a different philosophy. It was foolish of me to expect him to speak my language of quiet sentiment and historical reflection. My ways were the ways of the past, of dusty books and long, slow thoughts. His were the ways of the future. I dismissed the strange, hollow feeling in my chest as a symptom of my own age, a resistance to the very modernity I had worked so hard to provide for him. I had absolute faith in my son. He was my masterpiece, and tomorrow he would surely prove it. The party, in its initial hours, was everything a woman of 70 could hope for. My library, usually a sanctuary of scholarly silence, was filled with the warm, lively hum of conversation and laughter. My oldest friends were there, my most respected colleagues, their faces etched with the same lines of inquiry and intellect that I saw in my own mirror. Old Dr. Albright was comfortably seated, just as I'd wished. Dressed in the blue silk Marcus had requested, I moved through the room, not as a relic being honored, but as a cherished member of a vibrant intellectual tribe. I felt a deep, quiet happiness. At 8 o'clock, Marcus tapped a spoon against a crystal glass, calling for silence. The room quieted, faces turning towards him expectantly. He stood by the fireplace, radiating a polished confidence. He was in his element. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice projecting through the room. "We're here tonight to celebrate a significant milestone, my mother's 70th birthday. 70 years. An incredible legacy of scholarship, mentorship, and, of course, raising a reasonably successful son." "Nyadern, Belche," was. A ripple of polite laughter went through the room. I smiled, a genuine, proud smile. "But as we all know," he continued, his tone shifting from sentimental to managerial, "a legacy isn't just about looking backward. It's about strategic, forward-looking planning. It's about ensuring the future is as secure and well-managed as the past." I felt a slight intellectual disconnect from his words, the familiar intrusion of his corporate dialect into this personal space. But I watched him, my heart full. "My mother has given me everything," he said, looking at me. "She invested in me, and it's a debt I can never truly repay. But I believe the best way to honor that investment is to ensure her own future is optimized for peace, security, and well-being. So I have spent the last 6 months performing my due diligence, researching strategic solutions and securing what I believe is the perfect next step. A true game changer." He stooped and lifted a large, flat gift box from beside the fireplace. It was exquisitely wrapped in heavy silver paper with a perfectly tied navy blue bow. He walked towards me, presenting it with a flourish. A hush of happy anticipation fell over the room. My friends were smiling, their eyes shining with warmth for me, for this moment. I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye, a tear of pure gratitude for my thoughtful, successful son. My hands, steady just a moment before, trembled slightly as I undid the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was not a rare book or a framed piece of art. It was a brochure. A thick, heavy, glossy brochure, produced with the kind of expense usually reserved for luxury real estate. I lifted it out. The cover showed a photoshopped image of a laughing, silver-haired couple playing lawn bowls on a pristine green. The title was embossed in gold lettering, "The Sterling Senior Community, Curated Living for Your Golden Years." I stared at it, my mind refusing to process the information. It felt like trying to read a language I had never seen before. My son's voice continued, a distant buzz in my ears. "A top-tier facility. The waiting list is over a year long, but I was able to leverage some connections to secure her a premium garden suite. A proactive measure, so we're not forced to make a difficult decision in a crisis." I was holding a teacup and saucer in my left hand. As the meaning of his words finally breached the walls of my disbelief, my hand moved with a slow, autonomous grace. I lowered the cup and placed it back on its saucer, which rested on a nearby table. In the sudden, ringing silence of my own mind, the quiet click of porcelain against porcelain sounded like a gunshot. My smile, the one I had been wearing all evening, remained fixed on my face, but it had become a brittle, fragile thing. The air in the room had changed. The warm hum of celebration had evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy, and deeply awkward silence. The polite smiles on my friends' faces had frozen, then dissolved into expressions of confusion, pity, and embarrassment on my behalf. Dr. Albright was staring into his lab. My colleague from the classics department was looking at Marcus with an expression of undisguised contempt. They understood. Every single person in that room, a person who knew my life, my mind, my fierce independence, understood the profound, public nature of the dismissal I had just been handed. My son had not given me a gift. He had given me a verdict. He had looked at my life, my library, my work, and declared it over. I was no longer a person. I was a problem to be managed, a future liability to be neutralized. I was a loose end, and he, my masterpiece, had just tied me up in a neat, strategic bow. The party died in that single, terrible moment. Soon after, the exodus began. My friends and colleagues came to me one by one, their words of farewell quiet and strained. They hugged me a little too tightly, their eyes filled with a shared, unspoken sorrow. No one knew what to say. Within the hour, I was alone. The room was a landscape of half-empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and the lingering ghost of laughter. And in my hand, I held the glossy brochure. Its weight felt immense. The smiling, anonymous couple on the cover seemed to be mocking me. The foundation of my life, the unwavering belief in the masterpiece I had created, had not just cracked. It had been pulverized into dust. The door clicked shut behind the last of my friends, and the silence that descended was unlike any I had ever known in this house. It was not the peaceful, scholarly silence of contemplation. It was a vacuum, a void left by the sudden, violent extraction of dignity. I stood motionless in the center of my library, surrounded by the debris of a celebration that had become a weight. My life's work, bound in leather and ink, stood sentinel on the shelves, silent witnesses to my public execution. Hours passed. I did not move to clear the glasses. I did not turn off the soft lamps. I simply sat down in my armchair, the one my husband always favored, and stared at the object on the coffee table. The brochure. It lay there, glossy and self-assured, a slick piece of propaganda for my own obsolescence. It was no longer a gift. It was a primary source document detailing the terms of my surrender. My entire life had been built upon a single, central thesis, that my son, Marcus, was my masterpiece. It was a thesis supported by decades of evidence, his academic achievements, his professional success, the confident man he had become. I had invested my life in that thesis. And now, in a single evening, he had presented me with irrefutable, contradictory evidence that proved my entire life's work was fundamentally flawed. My mind, the trained mind of a historian, began to do what it does best. It began to re-examine the historical record. Every memory of his ambition, every instance of his corporate speak, every time he had dismissed my sentimentality with a brisk, "That's nice, Mom." They were no longer footnotes to his success story. They were critical data points I had misinterpreted. The strategic solutions and value adds were not quirky terms of affection. They were the cold, clear language of his actual belief system. He saw the world, and everyone in it, as an asset or a liability. And I, his mother, had just been reclassified. The injustice of it was a cold, physical weight in my chest. I have never been afraid of age. I have read Cicero on the subject. I have studied the great minds and artists who produced their finest work in their final decades. My mind is my most valuable asset, sharper now with the wisdom of 70 years than it ever was at 30. To have that mind, that life of fierce intellectual independence, dismissed as a problem to be managed, was an insult so profound it left me breathless. I was not a person to be respected, but a future risk to be mitigated. I was a burden. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours before dawn, I finally reached out and picked up the brochure. My hand was steady. The grief had settled into a kind of cold, heavy lethargy. The paper was thick and expensive, designed to feel substantial in the hands of worried children, making the difficult decision. I opened it. The language inside was a masterpiece of cheerful condescension. Worry-free living, a vibrant community of peers, curated activities to fill your golden years. There were pictures of smiling seniors painting watercolors and playing bridge. Curated activities. I, who was midway through a personal monograph on the economic policies of the Flavian dynasty, was being offered curated finger painting sessions. The bitter irony of it was a physical taste, like ash, in my mouth. My golden years were not something to be filled. They were already overflowing with the wealth of a life dedicated to knowledge. I closed the brochure and pushed it away, the slick paper sliding across the polished wood of the table. It came to rest against a stack of my research notes. It looked obscene there, a garish piece of modern marketing, polluting a sacred space. I felt like a museum piece, a relic on a shelf, respected for what it once was, but whose time for active use was over. My library was no longer my workshop. It was my exhibit, and my son was the curator, preparing to move me to a more suitable, climate-controlled storage facility. I sat there until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the tall windows, tracing the spines of the books I loved. The wave of pure, desolate sorrow had crested and begun to recede. And in the quiet aftermath, something else stirred. It was a familiar feeling, a flicker of the old fire. It was the historian's instinct. The deep, ingrained refusal to let a single piece of evidence, no matter how painful, be the final word. The need to understand, to analyze, to contextualize. My gaze fell upon the brochure again. The emotional charge had begun to dissipate, and I saw it for what it truly was. It was not a verdict. It was not a symbol. It was an artifact. An invoice for a debt of gratitude that had been grotesquely miscalculated. It was a piece of evidence. A historian does not discard a primary source. A historian examines it. Forensically. The historian's first duty in the face of a collapsed narrative is not to mourn, but to begin the meticulous work of salvage. One must return to the archives, to the primary sources, and re-examine every piece of evidence in the harsh, unforgiving light of the new reality. My son had handed me the conclusion to my life's thesis. It was now my job to reread the preceding chapters to understand how I could have gotten the entire story so profoundly wrong. My personal archives are not stored in a dusty attic, but in a climate-controlled closet off my study. Like any good librarian, I am a meticulous archivist of my own life. Everything is in labeled, acid-free boxes. With a cold, analytical purpose, I retrieved a stack of them, their familiar weight a small comfort. The labels read, Household Finances 1992,000, Correspondence. Marcus and 1, simply the Robert Collection. I began with the financial records. For hours, I sat at my large oak desk, the methodical turning of pages the only sound in the room. I was no longer a grieving mother. I was a researcher compiling data. Here were the tuition receipts from the elite private university Marcus had attended, the numbers on them still staggering. Here were the bank statements, showing the steady, systematic draining of my savings, funds that I had earmarked for my own research sabbaticals, trips to Rome and Athens that I had perpetually postponed. I found the records of the extra classes I had taught. History of the American West, a summer course dreaded by the tenured faculty for its rowdy, disengaged students. European History, 1815 to 1914, an evening extension class filled with wary adults trying to earn a credential. I had taken them all, willingly. Each paycheck from those classes was a line item in the budget for Marcus's books, his meal plan, his future. It was my professional sacrifice, the quiet trade-off of my own academic ambitions for his. Then, I opened the box labeled, The Robert Collection. Inside was a single, thin file. My late husband had been a passionate collector of early military histories. They were his one great indulgence. The file contained the bill of sale from a rare book dealer, dated the summer before Marcus's senior year. A first-edition translation of Caesar's Gallic Wars, bound in Moroccan leather. A signed copy of a biography of Scipio Africanus. He had cherished them. I had sold them to cover an unexpected increase in Marcus's senior year housing fees. I remembered the dealer's pitying look, the hollow feeling as I walked out of his shop with a check that felt like 30 pieces of silver. At the time, I had justified it as transforming one legacy into another, paper and ink into flesh and blood. Now, it just felt like a catastrophic loss. I did not weep. The time for that had passed. I was now simply an auditor, calculating the final tally. The capital outlay for Project Marcus had been immense. The emotional return on investment, I now understood, was a staggering, unrecoverable deficit. I had not been investing in a masterpiece. I had been funding the construction of a monument to his own self-interest. Finally, at the bottom of a box of legal papers, I found it. A heavy, bound document I had not touched in over 20 years. It was the charter for the Hayes Family Educational Trust. A faint memory surfaced, warm and then painful. Robert and I, in this very study, with our lawyer. We wanted to ensure Marcus would have every advantage, but Robert had been insistent on one point. "It's not a blank check, Althea," he had said, his hand resting on mine. "It's a foundation. He must always respect the foundation." With a deep sense of purpose, I opened the charter. My mind, so accustomed to deciphering the dense legalese of historical charters and treaties, moved easily through the boilerplate. It was a standard revocable trust, naming me as the sole trustee. It detailed the disbursement of funds for educational purposes. It was all exactly as I remembered. And then, my historian's eye, trained to notice the codicil, the annotation, the single word that changes the meaning of an entire text, fell upon Article 4, Section B. It was a clause I had written myself, insisted upon, channeling my husband's sentiment into the precise language of the law. My finger traced the words, the faded ink, a ghost of a past intention, now imbued with a terrible present power. The disbursements from this trust are designated as a gift, contingent upon the beneficiary upholding the foundational principles of familial duty, honor, and respect, upon which this trust was established. In the event of a material breach of these principles, as determined solely by the trustee, all prior and future disbursements may be immediately reclassified, at the trustee's discretion, from gift to loan, callable in full within 90 days and subject to I stopped. I read it again. And a third time. Familial duty. Honor. Respect. A sharp, quiet intake of breath was the only sound in the room. It was not a gasp of shock, but of profound crystalline clarity. This was not a footnote in my life story. This was the Rosetta Stone. The key to translating my son's actions into a language he would be forced to understand. The historian had just unearthed the weapon that had been buried in her own archives for 20 years. The trust document lay open on my desk, a silent testament to a younger version of myself. A woman who, with the foresight of a historian and the protective instincts of a mother, had planted a seed of consequence in the fertile ground of her generosity. For 20 years, that seed had lain dormant. Now, watered by the profound disrespect of her son, it had finally, terribly, begun to sprout. I spent the rest of the day in my chair, the document before me, the words of Article 4, Section B, burned into my mind. I was not wrestling with a decision. The decision had been made in the quiet, desolate hours after the party. I was, instead, formulating a thesis. Every academic paper, every historical argument, requires a clear, defensible thesis. My actions could not be driven by the raw emotion of a wounded mother. They had to be guided by the unimpeachable logic of a trustee fulfilling her fiduciary duty. My son saw me as a relic, a beloved, perhaps, but ultimately finished object. A classic book on a shelf, to be pointed at with pride. That's my mother, the professor, but never again to be taken down and consulted. He had dusted off the cover, celebrated its long service, and then arranged for its transfer to a more suitable archive for preserved items. The irony was so profound it was almost beautiful in its symmetry. From his perspective, my life of active scholarship was over. He could not conceive that this relic, this woman of paper and tea, could possibly have any agency left, any power to affect his world of steel and glass and digital transactions. This pain of marginalization, which had felt like a shroud just days ago, now felt like a cloak of invisibility. It was my greatest advantage. He would never see this coming. He was prepared for tears, for angry phone calls, for the messy, emotional fallout of a family dispute. He was utterly unprepared for the cold, dispassionate execution of a contractual obligation. He was a general who had planned for a frontal assault, leaving his supply lines completely undefended against a single, silent saboteur. Was this revenge? My mind, trained in the art of precise definition, rejected the term. Revenge is a chaotic, emotional act, a reflexive strike born of rage. This was not rage. The fire of that initial shock had burned out, leaving behind the hard, cold clarity of purpose. This was to be an educational exercise. My son, my most promising student, had failed a critical examination on the foundational principles of the course of his own life. As his first and most important professor, it was my duty to administer the final remedial lesson. He had misunderstood the nature of his inheritance. He believed it was purely financial. I would now be forced to teach him that it was, and had always been, conditional. The true inheritance was one of values, and it was a lesson for which he was about to be charged tuition. My mind drifted to the history of the Roman Republic, to the concept of dignitas. It was not just dignity in the modern sense. It was a man's accumulated worth, his standing, his reputation, his adherence to the unspoken rules of society. A loss of dignitas was a fate worse than death. My son had not only damaged his own, he had attempted to strip me of mine. He had mistaken my quiet life for a weak one. He had forgotten that the most powerful figures in history are often not the ones who shout the loudest, but the ones who understand the subtle, inexorable mechanics of power. My hands, which had felt so frail and old just yesterday, now felt steady as they rested on the document. There was a quiet strength in them, the strength of a person who holds an unassailable truth. The plan began to form in my mind, not as a messy scrawl of anger, but as a clean, elegant syllabus. It would have 3 parts: a formal notification, a period for response, and a final, unavoidable consequence. It would be executed without a single raised voice. The emotional turmoil was over. I was no longer Althea Hayes, the wounded mother. I was Althea Hayes, trustee of the Hayes Family Educational Trust, and I had a duty to perform. I reached for the telephone. I did not call Marcus. I did not call a friend. I called the office of my longtime estate lawyer, a quiet, meticulous man named Arthur Penn, whose father had been my father's lawyer. It was a firm that understood the long arc of family history. Mr. Penn's office, his assistant answered. "This is Dr. Althea Hayes," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I need to schedule an appointment with Mr. Penn. I wish to discuss the execution of a specific clause within a family trust I hold as trustee." The research was complete. The thesis was clear. The lesson plan was now being drafted. The law offices of Penn, and Son occupied the same distinguished brownstone they had for the better part of a century. The interior was a quiet cathedral of jurisprudence. The air smelled of old leather, floor wax, and the dry, reassuring scent of case law bound in buckram. It was a place where precedent held sway, where the written word was sacrosanct. It was, in short, my territory. Arthur Penn, the 3rd generation of his family to manage my family's affairs, greeted me himself. He was a man in his late 50s, with a calm demeanor and eyes that had long ago learned to listen more than they spoke. He was a man who understood history, both legal and personal. "Dr. Hayes," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "It's always a pleasure. Please come in." His office was lined with books from floor to ceiling, not unlike my own library, though his were filled with statutes and torts instead of empires and revolutions. I sat in a firm leather chair opposite his vast oak desk, declining his offer of coffee. I wanted nothing to cloud my focus. I began not with an accusation, but with a query. "Arthur," I said, My tone is even as if I were opening a faculty meeting. I am here for a point of clarification regarding a family trust my late husband and I established some years ago. It's a matter of academic interest, you might say. I wish to understand the full enforceability of a specific clause. I slid the heavy bound document across the polished desk. The Hayes Family Educational Trust. I would draw your attention to Article 4, Section B. Mr. Penn adjusted his spectacles and began to read. He read the clause once, then a second time, his expression unreadable. This was a man accustomed to familial disputes, to the messy intersection of money and emotion. "It's an unusual clause, Dr. Hayes," he said finally, looking up at me. "But brilliantly drafted, if I may say so. Your husband's influence, I presume? He always had a strong sense of principle." "It was a mutual sentiment," I replied. "My question, Arthur, is a hypothetical one. If a trustee were to determine that a material breach of the foundational principles had occurred, how would this clause stand up to a legal challenge?" He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his chin. "Legally, it is ironclad. The language is precise. The power to determine a breach is granted solely to you, the trustee. Your discretion is absolute. The terms for reclassification and recovery are explicit. A challenger would have a difficult, and I would say insurmountable, task in arguing against the plain text of a document they themselves benefited from." "Nico." I nodded slowly, absorbing his professional assessment. The foundation was as solid as I had designed it to be. "And what," I continued, "might constitute a material breach of familial duty, honor, and respect in the eyes of the court?" This was the critical question. Mr. Penn's gaze sharpened. He understood we were moving from the hypothetical to the specific. That would be a matter of fact and evidence. The trustee would need to present a reasonable basis for their determination. A compelling narrative supported by primary sources, so to speak. I reached into my bag and produced my second piece of evidence. I placed the glossy brochure for the Sterling senior community on his desk, on top of the open trust document. "The primary source," I stated, my voice devoid of emotion. I then proceeded to recount the events of my 70th birthday party. I did so not as a wounded mother, but as a historian presenting a case study. I detailed my son's speech, the public nature of the gift, and its clear implication. I was concise, factual, and analytical. I presented the act as a clear, demonstrable attempt to divest me of my autonomy and relegate me to the status of a dependent, an action fundamentally at odds with the concept of honor and respect. When I finished, Mr. Penn was silent for a long moment. He looked at the garish brochure, then at the elegant, powerful clause in the trust, and then at me. A deep, professional gravity had settled over his features. "I see," he said, the words carrying a weight of understanding that went far beyond the legal. He took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief. "This is no longer a hypothetical question, is it, Althea?" The use of my first name was the signal. We were no longer client and lawyer discussing a contract. We were two old acquaintances discussing a profound breach of decency. "No, Arthur," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It is not." He put his glasses back on, his expression now one of cool, professional resolve. "The evidence you have presented is, in my opinion, more than sufficient to constitute a reasonable basis for your determination as trustee. The act itself, the public nature of it, the clear intent to manage your life against your will, is a profound demonstration of disrespect. It is a material breach of the spirit, if not the letter, of familial duty." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "Dr. Hayes, what are your instructions?" The moment was here. The final transition from thought to action. The Rubicon. "I am instructing you?" I said, meeting his gaze without blinking. "To proceed." A slow, deliberate nod was his only reply. "I will draft a formal letter of notification to your son, Mr. Marcus Hayes. It will be sent via certified mail. It will state that you, as trustee, have determined that a material breach of Article 4, Section B has occurred. It will inform him that all disbursements made from the trust for his education have been reclassified as a loan, effective immediately. We will include a preliminary, itemized statement of the principal and inform him that a full accounting with interest will follow. Neu, Gendani. I rose from my chair, my part in this meeting complete. The grim satisfaction I felt was not of victory, but of a just and necessary process being set in motion. I had presented my thesis. The institution of the law had found it sound. "Thank you, Arthur," I said. As I walked out of the quiet, ordered office and back into the chaotic world, I felt a new sense of purpose. The lesson plan was no longer a draft. It was being notarized. 2 days after my meeting with Mr. Penn, a sterile email appeared in my inbox. The subject line read simply, "Regarding Hayes Family Trust." The message was from his paralegal and contained only a PDF attachment and a single sentence. "The attached has been sent via certified mail to Mr. Marcus Hayes. Tracking number included for your records." I opened the attachment. It was a copy of the letter Mr. Penn had drafted. The language was cold, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a perfect translation of my resolve into the unassailable prose of the law. It quoted Article 4, Section B. It detailed the determination of the breach. It outlined the immediate reclassification of the gift to a loan. It was not a letter from a mother to a son. It was a formal notice of default from a trustee to a beneficiary. A syllabus of evidence for a lesson long overdue. I read it once, then closed the file. The first part of the lesson plan had been executed. I did not check the tracking number. To do so would have been an act of anxiety, of emotional investment in the outcome. My role in this stage was complete. I was a historian who had published her findings. It was now up to the world to react. My thesis was sound, my sources unimpeachable. I felt a quiet, academic calm. That week I did not remain in my house, waiting for the inevitable fallout. To do so would have been to give the situation power over my life. Instead, I immersed myself in the world that had always been my sanctuary. On Wednesday, the day I calculated the letter would likely be delivered, I took the train into the city and spent the afternoon at the Metropolitan Museum. I wandered through the Roman galleries, the same halls I had walked 1,000 times before. I stood for a long time before the bust of a long-dead emperor, his face a mask of stoic authority. History is a relentless teacher of cause and effect. An emperor overextends his reach, and the empire begins to crumble. A general places arrogance above strategy, and the battle is lost. A son mistakes love for weakness, and a trust is broken. The principles are immutable, scaling from empires to families with perfect, ruthless consistency. As I studied the cool marble of the emperor's eyes, I thought of the crisp paper of the certified letter arriving at my son's gleaming, modern office. I pictured him signing for it, his mind no doubt on market fluctuations and client acquisitions. He would see the return address from a law firm and assume it was a minor, tedious matter. Then he would open it. The juxtaposition was stark. My quiet contemplation of a 2,000-year-old empire's fall, and his sudden violent confrontation with the collapse of his own carefully constructed world. For a fleeting moment, a wave of maternal sadness washed over me. I did not relish the pain this lesson would inflict. There is no joy in failing a student, especially one in whom you had placed such profound hope. But a good teacher does not change the grade to spare the student's feelings. To do so is to devalue the very subject they teach. The lesson, however harsh, was necessary. It was the only path back to a foundation of truth. The rest of the week passed in a similar state of serene detachment. I worked on my monograph. I tended to my small garden. I spoke on the phone with old colleagues. I lived my life, the life he had declared over, with quiet, deliberate purpose. My home was not a fortress, bracing for a siege. It was a library, a place of peace, utterly insulated from the chaos I knew must be erupting in his. The first signal came on Friday evening. I was in my kitchen, preparing a simple meal, when my telephone rang. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Marcus. It was the first time he had attempted to contact me since the party. I looked at the ringing phone, and I felt nothing. No anger, no fear, no satisfaction. Only the quiet certainty of a predicted outcome. I let it ring until the call went to voicemail. A moment later, my mobile phone, which I kept for emergencies, buzzed on the counter. A text message from Marcus. Then another. And another. A rapid, frantic barrage of digital noise. Mom, call me now. I just got a letter from some lawyer. This is insane. You have to fix this. What did you do? I picked up the phone, looked at the frantic messages on the screen, and then I did something I had not done in years. I turned the ringer off and set it aside. The student had received his failing grade. He was now demanding an explanation from the professor. Office hours, I thought to myself with a flicker of dry academic humor, would be held at my convenience. A professor learns to recognize the sound of a student in a panic. It is a specific frequency of desperation, a blend of anger and fear that usually precedes a desperate plea for an extension on a term paper. I had not heard it in years, but on Saturday afternoon, I heard it again in the sound of a car engine being cut abruptly in my driveway, followed by the frantic, crunching footsteps on the gravel path. I was in my library, as I always was, reading a new biography of Catherine the Great. I had poured myself a cup of tea, its steam rising in a lazy spiral in the quiet afternoon light. I did not get up immediately when the doorbell began to chime, a series of sharp, angry stabs that violated the peace of my home. I placed a bookmark carefully in my book, took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, and then I went to the door. There stood my son, but he was a stranger. The polished, confident executive was gone, replaced by a disheveled, wild-eyed man. His hair was uncombed, his expensive shirt was wrinkled, and his face was pale, except for 2 angry patches of red on his cheeks. In his right hand, he clutched a sheaf of papers, crumpled into a fist, as if he had been strangling them for miles. It was, I recognized, the letter from Mr. Penn. "What is this?" he demanded, storming past me into the foyer, his voice cracking with rage. "What in God's name is this?" I closed the door, shutting out the outside world, and turned to face him with the same calm I would offer a student who had just burst into my office. "I believe the letter is quite self-explanatory, Marcus. Perhaps you should come into the library and sit down." "No." He followed me not to sit, but to pace, a caged animal in my quiet, ordered space. He threw the crumpled letter onto my desk. "This is a joke, right? A threat? Some kind of sick, twisted lesson? You can't be serious." I took my seat in my armchair. "I am the trustee of the Hayes Family Educational Trust," I said, my voice level and quiet. "I am always serious when it comes to my fiduciary duties." "Fiduciary duties?" he scoffed, a raw, hysterical laugh escaping his lips. "This isn't about duty. This is revenge. This is because of the birthday party, isn't it? Because I tried to do something smart, something responsible for you, and your pride got hurt." And I sharing. I let his accusations hang in the air. I refused to be drawn into that debate. The birthday party, the brochure, the public humiliation, that was my ground, and I would not cede it. "This is a matter of contractual obligation," I stated calmly. "The trust was established with clear, explicit conditions. You failed to meet them." "What conditions? Respect, honor." He spat the words out as if they were foreign and distasteful. "You're destroying my entire financial foundation over some vague, sentimental nonsense you wrote 20 years ago? I'll fight this. I'll get a lawyer. They'll laugh this out of court." "I doubt that," I said, taking another sip of my tea. Mr. Penn seemed to feel the language was, and I believe his word was, ironclad. "It's a legal document, Marcus, not a poem. Its meaning is not open to interpretation." His anger began to visibly crumble, replaced by the raw fear that had been simmering beneath it. The reality of his position was dawning on him. He stopped pacing and stared at me, his expression shifting to one of desperate pleading. "Mom, please," he whispered, the word "mom" now a plea for mercy. "You can't do this to me. The amount, with interest, it's ruinous. It would take me years, decades to pay this back. my career, my home, everything I've built. Everything you have built, I interjected, my voice still quiet, but now sharpened with the cold, hard edge of a diamond, was built on a foundation that you did not pay for. A foundation that was gifted to you under specific, well-articulated terms. You have broken the terms of the agreement. As trustee, I am simply executing the consequences outlined in the document. He stared at me, searching my face for a flicker of maternal weakness, a hint of emotional leverage. He found none. He found only the impassive resolve of the trustee. He had come here expecting a mother he could argue with, manipulate, or emotionally blackmail. He found a professor who had graded his final exam, and the grade was non-negotiable. He sank into the chair opposite me, utterly defeated. The fight had gone out of him, leaving behind a hollow, broken man. He ran his hands through his hair, the crumpled letter lying on the desk between us like the wreckage of a crashed vehicle. He finally understood. He had no legal standing. He had no moral high ground. He had no emotional purchase. All of his modern, aggressive, corporate tactics were useless against the quiet, unshakable power of a forgotten clause and the old woman he had so grievously underestimated. He sat there in silence for a long time. Finally, he stood up, his movements slow and heavy. He did not look at me. He simply turned and walked out of the library, out of my house, taking his ruin with him. I remained in my chair, the quiet of the room settling back into its familiar shape. The confrontation had not disturbed my peace. It had merely confirmed the grim necessity of the lesson. The final exam was over, and the cost of his failure was now his, and his alone, to bear. The weeks following the confrontation unfolded in a profound and unbroken quiet. The frantic calls and messages ceased. The silence that took their place was not the heavy, painful silence of grief, but the clean, calm silence that follows a necessary storm. It was the quiet of a library after the students have gone home, a space for order and contemplation to reassert itself. I did not reach out to Marcus. A professor does not chase after a student who has failed an exam. You post the grade and trust that the lesson, in its own time, will do its work. One morning, nearly 2 months later, the mail brought a single, unfamiliar envelope. It was not a business envelope from his office, nor was it a crisp, impersonal greeting card. It was a simple, heavy piece of cream-colored stationery, addressed to me in my son's hand. I studied the handwriting before I even opened it. The bold, confident scrawl of the executive was gone. This script was slower, more deliberate, as if each letter had been carefully considered. It was the handwriting of a man humbled. I took the letter to my study, slid it open with my silver letter opener, and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was short. "Mother," it began, "I have been giving the events of the last few months a great deal of thought. There is no excuse for my actions, nor for the profound disrespect I showed you. It was a failure of character for which I am solely responsible. I have arranged with Mr. Penn's office to begin making regular payments to the trust. It is a debt I incurred, and one I will honor. I do not expect forgiveness. I only hope that in time, you might allow me the opportunity to earn back a place in your life on terms acceptable to you. Yours, Marcus." I read the letter 3 times. My historian's mind analyzed it like a primary source. There was no corporate jargon. There were no justifications. There were no accusations. There was only a simple, unqualified admission of failure, an acceptance of the consequences, and a humble request for a path forward. He had finally learned to speak my language. He had understood that the debt was not merely financial, but moral. The lesson, it seemed, had been received. I folded the letter and placed it inside a new file folder. On the tab, I wrote a single word, epilogue. Now, I sit in my library, several more months having passed. A cup of jasmine tea sends a fragrant steam into the cool autumn air. The afternoon sun slants through the windows, illuminating the spines of my books, my old, steadfast friends. The house is quiet, but it is a living quiet once more. Marcus was here yesterday. He did not bring a strategic solution or a game-changing gift. He brought a small, rare book on the Ptolemaic dynasty he had found in a dusty little shop, a book he thought I might enjoy. He did not apologize again. The words were not necessary. Instead, he sat in the chair opposite me and asked me about my research. He listened, with genuine interest, as I spoke of the intricate politics of ancient Alexandria. He listened, and he learned. Our relationship is not what it was. It is something new. It is quieter, more cautious, but it is built, for the first time, on the bedrock of mutual respect. And sitting here, in my favorite place, with a cup of tea in my hand, I finally understand the true nature of a legacy. It is not an inheritance you leave for someone, like a stock portfolio or a piece of property. It is the principles you instill in them. True education is not about providing the right answers, but about administering the necessary lessons, no matter how harsh, that allow the student to find the truth for themselves. The years have taught me that wisdom is more powerful than rage. If you have a similar story, feel free to share your wisdom in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.